Hello and welcome to Voice of Super, ASFA's podcast for everyone who works in super or has an interest in this incredibly important sector. Here we dissect and discuss the biggest issues in super with the best minds from in super and beyond. I'm Mary Delahunty, the CEO of ASFA, and today I'm delighted to welcome Simon Welsh, Director of Research and Regulation at RedBridge, and ASFA's Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer James Covell to the podcast to discuss the results of a major piece of research by RedBridge into how people feel and think about various aspects of superannuation carried out on behalf of ASFA. So thanks for joining us, Simon, and James. Welcome to Voice of Super. So every year ASFA commissions some research, really in-depth research looking at how Australians feel and perceive their super. And over the next few months, we roll out different bits of that research that really embeds conversations that we have with Australians. But we thought we'd pull together some of those results here today and have a quick discussion about them. So let's go. What are some of the key takeaways from this research, Simon?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly positive piece of research for the industry and a real endorsement of what we've been doing. So what we've seen is that the level of trust, particularly for superannuation, is really high. So we talked about, I think it's around 3/4 of people have a real trust in their super fund to make good decisions about their money and look after their kind of financial interests. And so I think what's interesting in the results, there's a number of things that are interesting, but one of the things that's particularly interesting is that trust is both high in the absolute sense, as I talked about, 76% of people have a high degree of trust, but it's also high in the relative sense. So we looked at sort of where does superannuation and super funds sit in relation to banks, to insurance companies, to other sort of finance sort of sector players. And, we are incredibly highly trusted. We sit higher than the banks in terms of people seeing us as the most trusted sort of entity within that kind of financial space, and certainly way above insurance companies. Insurance companies taken a bit of a pounding, to be honest with you, in this survey, which is something that doesn't particularly surprise me because we do hear a lot in our other work about the costs of insurance and how they've increased over sort of the last sort of year or two. So I think that's kind of feeding into what's happening around insurance. But very much high in an absolute sense, high trust in a relative sense compared to sort of other players in our industry.
It's very precious, isn't it? James, you and I think about this all the time, don't we? This sort of how precious that trust is, where it's come from, how we make sure that we're safeguarding it. But what did you take away from some of that high level findings?
Yeah, thank you. I think when you look at some of those findings, you're seeing across the board this high level of trust, but it's also in the way that some of these questions are phrased. There's these sort of longer term questions, so asking about how people feel and level of trust they have in superannuation funds, making good financial decisions with that money. That's a bit of a longer term question. Then you have, I suppose, a bit of a shorter term question, just a very simple: are you happy with the performance of your super fund? And certainly, there's been no shortage of, I guess, volatility recently. We've certainly noticed a little bit of that, and we see some discrepancies. It's not all overly positive news. We see positive results across the board, and we particularly see those aged over 65 really seeing the benefits of the system, and that makes sense. People who are entering retirement will have higher balances than those just entering the workforce now. But when you ask that sort of longer term question, trust in sort of superannuation, making good financial decisions, even amongst younger Australians, we're seeing really high levels of support. But in terms of some of these shorter term considerations, there is one gap, which is those who, as defined in the polling, speak languages other than English at home.
Right. Okay. So we break down that sort of cohort to, what's your background, what happens in your home life, and you kind of relate that to those elements of trust. Yeah.
Well, exactly, and Simon can probably give some insights into sort of how that information is gathered and some of the I guess sort of importance of that from a scientific perspective as you're undertaking these polls. But what we sort of saw is that, just using some of the high level stat, there was a plus 68% agreeing with this sort of concept amongst the overall population, but it went down to about plus 31% for those speaking other languages at home. And so even with a smaller sort of sample of people within some of those sub-demographics, it's still really interesting seeing that. And we also see that reflected in our sector. Like we see that reflected when we look at people's account balances.
Yes, yeah, we do. We see that there's differences in outcomes for people with non-English speaking backgrounds, and that's something, as you're saying, that is related then to trust. Simon, does that pop up when you're doing comparative research in other sectors as well, or what do you make of that sort of outlier?
Yeah. So when we're doing qualitative research around superannuation, so that's sort of focus groups and those sorts of things, yeah, we speak to people from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, and what we find is there's sort of two barriers, for want of better expression, around it. One is if they've moved to Australia, they don't necessarily have that sort of ingrained. So super is now part of the furniture for most Australians. You know, we kind of get what it's about. We get what it's for. We've bought into the purpose and the role of super in a big way. We trust that. If you don't have that kind of acculturation to super, that's part of why we often see sort of hesitancies from newly migrant groups in that particular case. And the other thing is just simply language. So one thing that we do hear a lot is that a lot of the information that is out there from super funds broadly isn't necessarily produced in a way that's easily accessible, easily findable for me as someone who doesn't speak English as a first language. So I think there's a couple of things that going on there that I think are not necessarily about sort of the performance of the industry, but rather in a financial sense, but around those other aspects of sort of acculturation and communications performance, I suppose.
It's a really good lesson for us, I think. It's something to dig into over the next year or so, because that I think we all agree that Australia is really stronger from its multicultural background, that we want everyone to feel and know that super is a national asset, but that if we're not getting through to some of the people who for whom English is a second language, then we actually haven't achieved that.
And I think it also goes into some of the important advocacy work that that the whole sector needs to look at. We identify the strong pillars that makes superannuation such a success. You look at things like the universality of it, but then you look at sectors like gig economy workers, and that makes you wonder, well, do we have sufficient coverage there? And is that accounting for some of the gap and for some of this difference in perceptions? And we also have a strong, focus on ensuring equitable outcomes for all Australians. But then we, need to make sure that with regards to the low income super tax offset, some of those who are, lower income earners in society are the sort of supports that are being provided at that end of the spectrum keeping up. And the answer, as we've sort of identified, is no. And that's why those advocacy efforts come in, because clearly what we're seeing is that from policy settings, there's a gap, and that gap is being reflected in people's perceptions of the system, which whilst high overall, whilst working overall, has some gaps.
Yeah, that's...
I think that...
Yeah,
sorry, if I just comment quickly,
yeah.
I think that advocacy angle is really important because we've just seen a federal election that was incredibly defined by what young and diverse voters did. The voters that moved off the Liberals during the campaign were those young and diverse voters. We know they are the voters that will be animating policymakers for at least the next term and probably the next 20 years of Australian politics. And as James has touched on, we talked about the diverse voters, and there's I hesitate to say sort of lower levels of trust. They're just not as positive as other areas. But similarly for the younger cohort as well, when we looked in the breakouts of the data here, the 18 to 34, the results aren't as strong. They're still strong, but they're not as strong as they are for the older cohorts as well. And I think that's in part about sort of engagement and just where they're at and sort of where super sort of sits on their priorities and things at the moment. But it leaves the door ajar. So we saw in this survey, we asked folk about the super for housing policy, and it was quite popular amongst the apologise, my dog has just walked through the back. It was quite popular amongst the 18 to 34-year-olds because of that sort of economic financial distress that they're under at the moment. So where we've got this political landscape that is going to be animated, and when I say animated, policymakers animated by younger cohorts, diverse cohorts that define the result of this election, making the case to them about super, about the importance of super in those particular cohorts is going to be really critical in an advocacy sense.
Do you see the effects of the COVID sort of investment fund returns and anything playing a part in how people view their super, especially in those cohorts?
I was just thinking on that particular question, and Simon can probably add a bit more to this, but certainly when we talk about that perception of happiness with the performance of one's fund, as Simon says, we're not talking about people being dissatisfied. We're just talking about slightly different levels,
right,
of that satisfaction. But certainly for those who are over the age of 65, we see things like plus 82% sort of agreeing with that premise, whereas we sort of move to about plus 73%.
Yeah, so we're still in the positive territory, but noting those lower levels of delight.
And in terms of the impact of COVID early release, for example, we know that saw many people either significantly reduce their balance or in many cases entirely close their super accounts. And so for a lot of people, particularly in that younger demographic, you're almost coming out of that and starting from scratch. And so no wonder that you're not quite seeing, in terms of this short-term question, that same level of compounding and growth as you might see if you've got a high balance.
Yeah, got it. What about this proposition? We asked this question as a part of the polling. Superannuation provides better long-term financial outcomes for Australians than if they manage their retirement savings on their own. I quite like this. I like this question because often, just like how we're all marketers and we're all good at, I don't know, things that we bet on and, stuff like that. We all think we're kind of experts in fields. So this is a good question to ask, I reckon. Simon, what did you make about the answer?
And it helps when there's double-digit returns.
Yeah.
The results are overwhelmingly positive. So we've got the we often talk about, as James has talked about here, this sort of the net sort of result. This is where you sort of add together all the positive results and you take away the negative results. And so to have a net 62, this is people agreeing with that proposition that it's better off, my money's better off in super than me managing on my own is quite considerable. And it's pretty consistent. We do see a little bit of an age effect that actually runs in reverse to some of the age effects that we've been talking about previously, but still the quantum is very much in favourable. I think an interesting aspect there is that agreement with that idea that my money is better off in super, men actually rated higher than women. You would expect, the normal sort of caricature is that men often like to see themselves as masters of their own universe.
No, I wouldn't. No, I don't know where you're getting that, Simon. Really.
And so there's some interesting stuff there. And I think it's important, and I think it's one of the sort of the interesting insights from this piece of work is it sort of speaks to where this trust comes from. So we've talked about these higher levels of trust, but where does it come from? Why do they trust us in this way? And there's two bits to it. The first is what I would broadly call sort of security. So that's this idea that my money's safe, it's well looked after, there's good things happening with my money. And I think this result really speaks to that, this sense that it's in the right place. So that sense of security is really important. It's about that. ROI is very much a part of that. But also is that sense of, linked to that security is that sense of, and therefore that means my retirement's going to be okay. And I'll come back to that in a second because that's a double-edged sword. I'll come back to that in a second. But then the other aspect of it that we saw here is, because arguably you could have all those things in a bank. You can have your money tucked away, getting a good ROI, it's safe, it's secure, it's not going anywhere. You can get that from a bank. The bit that was different about the super funds, and we've seen this qualitatively, which is why we put it in the survey, was this sort of question that for a super fund to do well, it means its members have to do well. This idea of mutuality, we don't see that on banks and other sorts of financial institutions. So banks, particularly over the last sort of few years in the Royal Commission and all these sorts of things, have done a job where it's almost a sense that the banks do well at my expense.
Right.
Where,
there's an otherness to it. Yeah.
where with the super funds, what we're seeing is more a sense of mutuality. You do well when I do well. And that, I think, is really important to understanding. So yes, it's about ROI. It's it's great that people think that their money's safe with us and all the rest of it. Absolutely critical part of it. But this sense of mutuality is really important as well. Now, that part of that security, as I say, is about this sense of, if we're getting the good ROI, I know my super fund's looking after me because they've got the same, our interests are aligned in this sense of mutuality. That's all good, and therefore my retirement's going to be okay.
Yeah.
This is the risk for the industry, because we know that for a lot of people, retirement is not going to be okay. Super balances aren't what you're going to need to be able to survive, and there is this sticky perception out there that, because I've put into super all my life, I'll be able to live well, not lavishly, but well,
Yeah. But it's just
without
one
a pension.
Yeah. Yep. Got it. Yeah.
And that I think, as sort of particularly sort of the Gen X generation starts to get closer and closer, and they're starting to tune in more to balances and do those sums and tune into those sorts of things that are telling them how much super do you need. That, I think, is a risk for the industry. It's not here yet. It might be 5 years away, 10 years away, but there is this risk when people start to do the math and realize, I'm not going to be able to have the retirement I thought I was going to have. Do we? This is a question. And do we sort of see then a sense of, maybe I've been gypped here. Maybe I've been misled. Maybe I've been lied to all along. That things really weren't.
That
And
starts
super
to undermine that mutuality sort of feeling.
Exactly.
James,
Yeah.
thoughts?
Well, this actually goes into something I think you've commented on quite recently, Mary. This sort of concept of mutuality, this sort of relationship that funds have with members as opposed to customers, and does that does that change how I suppose work is being done? Does that change the concept of what these performances mean? Do people sort of feel a bit more, I guess, involved? And a bit more sort of commitment beyond just necessarily a singular transaction. And so I just wonder whether that sort of concept that you've talked about might also reflect in some of this higher level of trust insofar as institutions are concerned.
Well, I hope so. It's certainly a head scratcher to end on. I really want to thank you both, Simon and James, for joining us on the podcast today. And don't forget to subscribe to get the latest episode of Voice of Super straight to your podcast library. See you next time.